Thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring today's video. From websites and online stores, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build beautiful online presence. Hello friends, I hope that you've been well. In today's video, we are going to be working on my Patreon print reward. And to start out, we have a little thumbnail sketch here using a highlighter and a ballpoint pen. The theme is fairies, and I decided I wanted to use this hot press watercolor block. And I typically peel them out of the block and then use a light table to trace on my sketch because I like to do a lot of my sketches digitally. But this time around, I thought, you know what? Let's actually just sketch directly onto the block and actually use the watercolor block as intended, which allows you to be able to paint on it without having to tape it down, and it's not going to warp and things like that. And yeah, I took a chance by sketching directly onto the paper and just sort of following my thumbnail sketch there, and I ended up really liking it, although admittedly it is, on the simpler side, but that was kind of the purpose. I wanted to just do a cute little portrait because I wanted to use this as an opportunity to test out the new Holbein color pencils that I bought from my trip to Japan earlier this year. And knowing that I wanted to use these color pencils, that's why I also had chosen hot press paper since it has a smoother finish. And I really wanted to go with a very summery color palette, and I really wanted to feature some bright greens. And I also kind of had it in mind that I wanted it to feel cohesive with the sticker design that I had done, which I'll have on screen for you. It's going to have like a holographic finish on the edges and the butterfly wing, or the fairy wing I should say, which I think will be very cute. So you have until the end of July to sign up if you're interested in receiving this sticker and the print artwork in the mail. Worldwide shipping is included, just so you know. And when it comes to using color pencils, personally, I like to use them with other mediums. And so I decided to kind of go along with the theme of using the Holbein brand. So I'm also going to be using the Holbein watercolors that I received in the Miyazaki art kit that I got at the Ghibli Museum 2 years ago on my Japan trip, and then the Holbein color pencils, which we will use later. So I have used these Holbein watercolors once in the video when I reviewed this Miyazaki set, and I have not touched them since. So I'm happy to finally be using them again. And I'm using this glass palette, which is the exact same palette that I used when I did that review, and so the paints that are left over are the same and have not been touched in quite a while. So as always, I start out with mixing up some skin tone colors, wetting the paper first, just really broad strokes here, and then I go ahead and start mapping in the paints. And so initially I used the magenta color for kind of the blushy areas, and sometimes I go in with the base skin tone first, sometimes I go in with blush. This time around I went with blush first, and I just put in blobs of this magenta color. And then while the paper and the paint is still wet, I kind of buff out the edges and then go in with the skin tone, which is a mixture of the yellow ochre and that magenta. And yeah, again, just like really painting in very quickly, not even really worrying about the edges there. I have recently kind of been enjoying having the color, like the skin tone color, sort of bleed into some of the parts of the hair, and I like having it really, really diffused. So that's why I just sort of keep it very wet when I'm painting in this section, so that there isn't really any like harsh lines. And then while that base skin tone is drying, I go ahead and start just putting in some of the background colors here. The thing about this illustration was I didn't go in with any concrete plan necessarily. I didn't even do like a digital color comp or anything like that. All I had was that initial sketch, thumbnail sketch that I showed you at the beginning. I wanted to embrace the spontaneity aspect for once, and you'll see how that sort of bites me in the butt later. But yeah, so initially I had used the magenta for the blushy parts, but then after putting in this kind of orangey red for the cherry, I decided that for her skin, it made more sense to stick with that orangey red color instead. So I switch over and start using that for the skin, and that way we get a much more harmonious color palette. And yeah, the magenta just felt a little bit too cool, and I really am glad that I switched over to this red instead, because not only does it make it more harmonious with the other reds and the yellows, it just feels more summery and like, yeah, very warm. And so I'm glad that I went in that route, which is pretty rare for me. I tend to prefer like the cool kind of magenta colors. But before we continue, I just want to take a moment to thank today's sponsor, Squarespace. So something that I really appreciate about Squarespace is that the Instagram plugin feature automatically updates on my website without me having to actually manually do it. That way, even if my main gallery hasn't been updated in a while, I like knowing that at least there's a section on my website that will always be showing my most recent work. And I also love how intuitive the design features are and that everything updates live as you're making the adjustments. And while I do find that the overall platform is very easy to use, there are great tools and posts readily available to help you out every step of the way. So if you're interested in launching your own website, head over to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/I'mAWonder for 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. So as I mentioned earlier, the only time I have used these whole bind watercolors was when I did the art review for the Miyazaki art kit. And for those of you who haven't seen that video, I painted with them in a different way than I normally would because I wanted to try and emulate the Miyazaki way of approaching them, which meant I was doing a graphite pencil sketch and then using the watercolors on top. And my first time using them, other than the swatches, was doing a landscape, and then I did a kind of more realistic portrait. And so I didn't really get like a proper sense of the paints, I would say, in terms of how I would actually use them in my typical illustrations. And so it was really nice to be able to use them for this, and they were so seamless to work with. It didn't feel difficult. I didn't feel like I was fighting with them in any way. They are non-granulating, which means they are like perfectly smooth. There's no like speckles or anything like that, or transitional pigments or anything like that, which is, you know, the pros and cons depends on what you're looking for. I do think that granulation in watercolors can be really, really beautiful, but it just depends on your preference. And for the illustration that I'm working on today, I do think that it made way more sense to go with something that wasn't granulating, just it has this very easy breezy, simple, cutesy look to it. And then I have been sort of trying to experiment with how I want to approach hair. And so I originally thought I was going to make this character's hair like really dark. And so I did this, the base highlight there with that red that was being used in her skin. And then I thought that I was going to have this kind of reddish brown as the transitional color, and then I fully intended to make her hair even darker by adding in like a black, like a brown black, to match the hair color that I had in the sticker design. But as I kind of worked on the hair with this brownish color, I ended up actually preferring the way that it looked because it just felt brighter and softer. And in the spirit of going with the flow, I ended up not going super dark on the hair. I thought that maybe it would look a little bit too harsh. And this character's hair style is totally different from the character that I drew in the sticker design anyway. So I thought there's no reason for me to keep them the same. And then for the eye color, I just kept it the same as the hair color. Again, this is a really straightforward way of making your color palette really harmonious throughout an illustration, is just to limit the colors that you're using and just reuse the same colors in different elements of the illustration. You'll see that earlier, those little pockets of bright blue that I had in the the background, I ended up actually putting a green on top of it because the blue just felt it was like standing out too much, and the green felt more harmonious with the other elements in this piece, in my opinion. I do end up introducing blue again later, but I think that in these phases of the illustration, the blue was just standing out too much in my eyes. And when I add in the darkness of that hair, you can see that the skin tone ended up looking way more washed out. So I'm just adding more layers of the red to her cheeks and her nose and her lips to really make it bright and saturated. And when it comes to the blending, I literally just like plop down that paint, and then I clean off my paintbrush and then buff out the edges with just like the clean, wet paintbrush. And the paper that I'm using, so I've actually used this paper for quite a long time. I just sort of use it very sporadically, randomly throughout the many years. And for a long time, I thought I didn't like it that much, but now that I'm using it again, I'm like, I don't know why I had any issues with it. Maybe it's because when I was initially using it, it was my first time using hot press paper and I didn't really understand how to use it or just what to expect from it maybe, but I actually ended up having a good time using it. And from my memory, it is more affordable in the grand spectrum of watercolor papers out there. So when this one finishes, I may or may not buy another one, just because in my current stock, I have a lot of cold press watercolor papers, but I don't have as much hot press watercolor papers. And lately I have been, getting more and more used to using it and seeing the benefits of using hot press paper, especially when it comes to wanting to use colored pencils. And then going back to the hair here, you can see I decided to keep that reddish brown tone. We're just deepening the areas, especially like right around the highlights, to make them pop. And it's so interesting that, that color that I initially put down seemed like such a bright red, and now in relation to all the other tones around it, it doesn't really come off as like a bright red anymore, like at all. But something that I have been enjoying doing with hair is making the color around it a little bit darker, particularly I think like right underneath the highlight, making it darker and then have it be a gradient into the next highlight, and so on and so forth, if that makes sense. Treating it like big blocks of shapes rather than individual hairs or anything like that. It's definitely, I think, an influence of, the anime, manga, manhwa style that has always been an inspiration for me, but I think I'm leaning more into it again lately. And keeping in line with this really summery, bright color palette, I use the same color that I used for the hair for the eyes and the eyebrows here, instead of using a black, which I think could have felt a little bit too stark, a little bit too harsh. When it came to her character design in that thumbnail sketch, I initially was intending to just recreate the character that I had drawn in the sticker design. That was the intention. I was like, I'll just draw, it'll be the same character. But then it just sort of morphed into this. And as you know, I'm a big lover of a baby bang. I draw many characters with baby bangs, but with the kind of pigtails and then the fringe framing pieces and her face, the vibes, I realized that she kind of reminds me of Zoe from the new Netflix Sony animated film K-pop Demon Hunters. Obviously, the hairstyle is a little bit different and Zoe has black hair, but there's like an energy and like vibe about this character that sort of reminds me of her, and I wouldn't be surprised if my subconscious was sort of going in that direction, because this movie has had an absolute chokehold on me, as I'm sure it has on a lot of you as well. And I had been listening to the soundtrack like on loop for quite a while now. But yeah, for those of you who don't follow me on Instagram or you aren't a patron of mine, I have already made my first K-pop Demon Hunters fan art, which was Seonghwa as a Saja boy, and it really popped off on my Instagram. I posted it as a reel, and it's insane the level of engagement that happens when something just sort of is favored in the algorithm, I suppose. My followers actually went up for once, which hasn't happened in a really long time. I still get tons of comments and shares on it. So thank you so much to everyone who has been engaging with that. But it's so fascinating because I posted the exact same reel on TikTok and on YouTube Shorts, and it did not perform in the same way as it did on Instagram. So it's just really interesting how the same video or content, whatever you want to call it, will perform on different platforms. That being said, the full version of the process of working on that Saja Seonghwa illustration is on my Patreon page. For $5, you get access to over 50 exclusive videos on there. And don't worry, I definitely will be making more Demon Hunters fan art, K-pop Demon Hunters fan art soon. Probably make own little video on it. But anyway, let's actually talk about these Holbein color pencils. So first impression is, of course, I absolutely love this color selection. I purposely picked the pastels because I knew that that would be a color palette that I would really love. And the initial impression that I had of them was the feel of it was very smooth and buttery, which is exactly what I was hoping for. Because if you don't know, the Prismacolor Premiere color pencils are my favorite up until this point because they have like really nice payoff because they're soft, but they break really easily. So I've just always been curious about trying something else that would still have that really beautiful color payoff but wouldn't break as much. So we'll see how these hold up over time, but right now, my impression of them is I do really, really like them. You can see how this blue really pops on top of this darker, brown base color. And to me, that's a good sign that they're nice and pigmented and soft enough to be able to have that kind of color payoff. I was really debating on what color I wanted to have the highlight be there. Initially, I tried using the yellows and the peaches, but then I landed on the pink. I think the pink was the winner. It looked the best, in my opinion, for the transition from the highlight to the base of the hair. I guess because the base of the hair is quite warm or like reddish pinky leaning, so it made sense to go with this pink there. And please don't hate me, but I did end up using other brands of color pencils for this illustration as well, since the Holbein one that I got is just pastels, so it is a bit limiting. So you can see I'm using my Prismacolor here. This vermilion color is one of my favorites. It's just such a beautiful, bright, kind of reddish orange. And then we're going in with some poster colors here. They're essentially like a gouache. They've since dried up since I've had them for so long, but you just add water and then they reactivate. And we are making the very bold strokes here of adding them in on top of this for the wings, because I still wanted her to be a fairy, since this is going to be, that's the theme for Patreon here. And I actually ended up using the watercolor mixed in with the white poster paint, and then I did use like that brighter green poster paint, like super watered down, because I wanted them to be transparent, hence why I put in the work of painting what was going to be underneath there. No, even though I knew that the wing was going to be there, because I wanted it to look translucent, which I do think I achieved. And I do really love how vibrant and beautiful these two kind of shades of green looked. But you'll see later that I end up actually struggling with them. So while that dried, I went ahead and added more color pencils to this background here. Here again, we're using the Holbein color pencils, and the pink is covering up the blue there pretty nicely. It's not perfect, obviously. I wanted this like layered look on purpose. But I will say something about working on the block is, since this block has been used, the glue that seals the edges is like really raised, and you can see I'm like really struggling to paint the edges there because of the ridges. So how do people get around that? I guess maybe a lot of people are not painting right up to the edge in the way that I am, but that was something that I was like, oh, I didn't anticipate this. This is very annoying. And then when it came to the line art, I wanted to primarily use colored pencils again, just to keep it textured and soft. And I will say I tend to gravitate towards using the Faber-Castell Polychromos for line art because they're a harder lead, so then I can sharpen them to like a really nice point. But I don't find that the color payoff is nearly as good. So you can see this like beautiful ultramarine blue is the Prismacolor one, and it has just like a much better color payoff. Like it's so punchy, and I ended up using that for the line art in a lot of areas. Not only does the blue stand out a lot more for against like the warm hair, but it also just creates like a fun dimension to it as opposed to just using like that dark burgundy in the hair. It just like totally got lost. As I mentioned earlier, the Prismacolor lead is very soft, and so it breaks quite easily. And so how I get around that is I use this pencil sharpener that allows you to adjust how much of the lead is exposed versus a typical sharpener, which is like quite long. And so having the lead exposed in a much like shallower degree, it breaks less. And then this was what the Holbein ones look straight out of the bin, which have like a flat tip, which I thought was odd. I'm on the fence about whether or not I want to sharpen the Holbein with a typical sharpener or if I want to go in the shallow route like I do with the Prismacolor. So we'll see over time how I feel about it, because nothing is more infuriating about using colored pencils when the lead just continues to break. And a tip that I remembered hearing from a teacher a very, very long time ago was to put your colored pencils in the microwave for like a couple of seconds, like literally a couple of seconds, like 5 seconds or less, I think. And basically what that would do was like help melt the lead so that they would, you know, like come back together from any cracks that had happened. But I haven't tried that method in a really, really long time. I remembered back in the day when I did it, I think I microwaved it for like slightly too long and like the wrapping started to bubble. So just be very, very careful with that. But might be something to consider if you find that you have a pencil that's just like breaking nonstop. Something that I absolutely had to do was throw in some of these neon colors here. This is from the Prismacolor ones, the orange and the pink. They just create like such a beautiful little pop of color, and I really enjoyed having them for her eyes and then like the highlights on her hair, and I added it a little bit to the cherry as well, just like really helped draw in the eye. And then for the background, I really wanted just to keep it simple because I wanted the focal point to be the character. So I didn't really worry about the background being a little bit quote unquote messy. And then of course had to go in with my Posca white paint marker to add in those juicy highlights. And then the next day, I think it was, I returned to the wings, and I did not have a plan for these. I was just, pun intended, trying to wing it. And that was a mistake, because the thing about the way that I did this compositionally, the wings are very, very cropped. And so you don't see the full wing. And when it's cropped like this, it's hard to tell what it is. And I also realized that the shape that I made them was like way too rounded. I think I really would have benefited from a different shape, like giving it a little bit more structure and having it like more pointed in where it's, you know, where it would be like attaching to her shoulder blade there. And so I was really, really frustrated with just how this was turning out. And I thought I completely ruined this illustration. There was no way to fix it because traditional media is very unforgiving, and there were so many elements about it that I just didn't know how I was going to be able to fix it. And so I was like, you know what, screw it. I'm just going to go digital for this because I really don't know where I'm going with that. And I didn't film it because I was just so frustrated and I had like, you know, performance anxiety. So thankfully, I do think that bringing it into Procreate ended up actually saving it. And I do believe that we have a convincing looking fairy wing there. And it's not like perfect per se, but I am glad that I was able to use these really nice textured brushes to make it look like it's not super obvious that it's digital. I hope it's not super obvious, that, you know, I want it to feel like it's seamless in the illustration here. So yeah, sometimes, you know, it feels like cheating because I'm a traditional girly, but sometimes, you know, you're on a deadline and you're frustrated and you just want to fix this illustration that you spent a lot of time on. So anyway, this is your sign to just go in the, you know, the route, the solution that is going to make the most sense for you. And in this case, for me, I decided to go digital for that. And yeah, I think it saved me a lot of heartache and I think it was the right way to go. So yeah, this is the final piece. And as a reminder, you have until the end of July to sign up to my Patreon page if you would like these girlies in the mail. And also you get access to wallpapers, exclusive videos, lots of extra little goodies over there. But if not, a like, comment, any kind of engagement is much appreciated. And I hope you have an amazing day or evening wherever you're at. And I'll catch you in the next one. Bye.